really what this was about was winning an election. It wouldn't surprise you to know that the dockyard at Adelaide played a rather significant role in the early decision to change course. It was just, I mean, it really shattered a lot of people's morale.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. In today's episode, we dive deep into the turbulent waters of international defence deals and national sovereignty with our returning guest, Andrew Fowler. We'll unravel the story of a significant global agreement that sent shockwaves worldwide, the scuttled submarine deal between Australia and France. How did a promising partnership descend into diplomatic disaster? And what does it tell us about the murky depths of global politics and the high stakes of military alliances? Join us as we explore the submarine fiasco that sank Australia's sovereignty right here on The Focus. Andrew, welcome back to The Focus.
Thank you.
Andrew, you've just released your new book, Nuked, the submarine fiasco that sank Australia's sovereignty. Can you provide a brief overview of your book and what prompted you to write about the collapse of the Australian submarine deal with France?
Well, what led me, John, to embark on this voyage was the sheer enormity of the program itself, the secrecy that surrounded it, and the fact that it was used as a political wedge against an opposition party. So it seemed to me that a defence procurement operation should be procuring material to defend Australia. And it seemed to me at the time that I embarked on this investigation that really what this was about was winning an election. And the secrecy that surrounded it was the thing that drew me closer to it, because I think as a journalist of several years standing, where there's secrecy, there's usually a reason for secrecy and there's a story behind it. And I thought the Australian public had a right to know where their money was being spent, because this wasn't just a few dollars. This was the biggest defence procurement event that we'd ever undertaken, to the tune of up to $368 billion.
So, Andrew, what key political dynamics within the Liberal National Coalition involving Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull, and Scott Morrison influenced the submarine deal's trajectory?
Well, its trajectory was kind of not in a straight line. It was actually kind of zigzagged, and it wouldn't surprise you to know that the dockyard at Adelaide played a rather significant role in the early decision to change course, because Abbott wanted to buy Japanese submarines, conventionally powered submarines, off the shelf. And the problem was the party, that's his party, didn't like the idea. They wanted to provide an industrial base in Adelaide, and it's that ongoing argument about how we actually deal with our defence procurement. So he then moved to say, okay, well, what I'll do is I'll set up a competitive evaluation process, and we'll get those submarines, the best ones, and we'll take a look at it. But by then it was too late, and no one really trusted Abbott, and so he was rolled by Malcolm Turnbull, who took over the competitive evaluation process, a very clumsy word, clumsy phrase, and set out to discover which submarine might be the best. And would it be the Japanese sub? Would it be the German submarine? Or would it be the French submarine?
So I remember those halcyon days well, because my company had been involved with the Royal United Services Institute of Australia, and we put together a sub-summit back in 2015. And it was all about trying to see what the various contending submarine designs were all about. My colleagues in the RUSI managed to pull together a very senior team from Japan. We had a couple of rear admirals who were Shinzo Abe's men who came out, and they had done something rather historic. For the first time in Japanese history, they promised to build their submarine, the Soryu class, here in Adelaide, which kind of broke a lot of preconceived notions about the Japanese boats because, as you rightly pointed out, Tony Abbott was the one that was championing the notion of buying the boats directly from Japan and cutting out the ASC middleman entirely. But as a South Australian, I knew that that wasn't going to fly because, of course, there were so many local interests that wanted the submarine plant to continue because, well, it was in our national interest for such a thing to continue. But yeah, the politics surrounding that whole episode was unbelievable. Suffice to say, when those two rear admirals came out, one tried in sort of naval technical terms to explain how they would have actually retrofitted the Soryu class, which was an existing Japanese design, to suit Australian standards. And, you know, just at that point, we'd not worked with the Japanese before, but they would have made whatever was necessary to make that thing work. It would have been their first capital equipment sold to another country. So it was pretty historic, just from the promise alone. Had it come to fruition, wow, we would have been in a totally different place. But, you know, it wasn't meant to be.
No, that's right. And also the Japanese boat that they put forward, because they hadn't got a history of exporting their arms, because of the history of the pacifist constitution, etc., they were a little wary of putting their best foot forward. So when it came to the CEP, that rather clumsy phrase, the three boats that were up, the Japanese hadn't really put their best boat forward, I'm told, by David Gould, who was the UK expert who'd worked for the Defence Department in the cabinet and involved in counter-terrorism, a very, very well-respected person. And he came in and looked at the three boats and said, well, look, you know, you've only got one boat here that wins, and that's the French boat. And the Defence Department said, well, what about the German boat? I mean, surely, you know, the German boat's a really good boat, isn't it? And Gould said, well, what makes you say that? And the Defence Department guy said, well, look, it's, you know, they're actually going to give us the intellectual property rights and we can have them forever. Whereas the French, they're not going to, they'll let us use them, but they won't actually give them for sure forever. And we have to work under licensing with them. And Gould said, well, why do you think that is? And the defence guy says, well, I don't know. I mean, the French are just being, whatever, too stingy to us. He said, no, the point is the German IP isn't worth a pinch of salt. And the French one is absolutely the crown jewels of stealth technology. It's by far the best boat. And that's the reason that they won't give you access, you know, without it being a license, for those particular stealth capabilities, including the propulsion system, which is apparently very quiet.
What, of course, made the French deal so compelling, which you go into in some depth with your book, is the fact that it was both a conventional boat, at least we were getting a conventional boat from the French, but it came from a nuclear boat design. So we could literally slip out the conventional propulsion unit and put in a French nuclear propulsion unit had we so chosen, which would have allowed the Royal Australian Navy to have a much greater degree of flexibility in terms of how they would have approached everything. So I suppose that was their big reveal, and it was something that the other two countries just simply couldn't compete against.
Exactly right. I mean, the irony of all these ironies is that this was a nuclear-powered boat that we'd actually decided to take the reactor out of and put diesels into. And it would have been absolutely easy to have just left the reactor where it was and taken that. And that was certainly floated by Naval Group as a possibility. They drew up actually a plan. The great unknown in all this is whether that was actually put forward directly to Macron. But we certainly know it was there. And we certainly know that Turnbull says that he had that in mind when he went for the French boat, that they could always do, as you say, just take the boat as it was, if the French would agree to it. And he said that, and I've been told that there were agreements that down the track, not at that time, not just a few years ago, but down the track, if we wanted to switch across, as Turnbull says, if the environment was right, that people believed in Australia that nuclear was the best option, then we could switch to it. So it seemed to be a pretty sensible deal, plus the fact that they the French, use low enriched uranium, which is less problematic from a non-proliferation treaty position, and it's also far less dangerous and much easier to dispose of.
So, how did President Macron view the submarine deal with Australia, and what were France's strategic and economic expectations?
Look, here's the point to boil this down. The French viewed this as a strategic relationship with Australia. And what they say is that Australia viewed it as a purely commercial operation. So with those two views running against each other, those two strategic positions running against each other, you can see where there were problems. The French were saying, look, they're just treating this just like they're buying sort of a car, they're buying something. It's actually about engaging in a full strategic relationship between France, Australia, and of course, at one time, Macron pulled in India as well into an agreement. And of course, this would have caused and did cause a certain amount of anxiety in Washington, that have always seen Australia as being a #1 pal, particularly in the Southeast Asian area. And to have France coming in, and the French have a very independent foreign policy, far more independent, may I suggest, than other countries, including Australia. And they have a history of disagreeing with the Americans. So over Iraq, for example, and also over the treatment of China, Macron's been quite outspoken about the Belt and Road policy being the new Silk Road, not a phrase that goes down too well in Washington. So you can see that the Americans, and as I catalogue in the book, were right in there pushing out the French and muscling in on getting their submarines.
The interesting thing, of course, is intellectual property concessions. Australia is an island continent, and I'm sure that most of our audience will understand the strategic necessity for being able to develop as much of foreign technology here as possible. So when it comes to deep maintenance, we can do that to our own boats without having to send it off to France or sending it off now to the United States, for instance. And now with the reinvention of state-on-state conventional war, this becomes even more of an imperative, because being an island continent cut off from most supply routes to North America and Europe, we need to do more. So what were the French willing to do to secure the submarine deal with Australia? And how significant was this from a technological transfer perspective? Yeah.
The technology transfer went as far as sharing the very, very secret propulsion system mechanism that drove the boat. Now, the detail of that is so secret. When I was talking to David Gould in London about this, he said he couldn't talk about it, but I confirmed it elsewhere. That was the heart of it, to actually allow Australia to have access to the propulsion system and all that entails that powers their nuclear strike force, was a real good get. Now, how much Australia will be able to use that outside, I think is questionable. I don't think they had the right to do that. But the learning you get, as I think they say the phrase is the know how and the know why. That would have been passed on to Australia. The other thing, which is a lot more straightforward, is that they shared the system by which the French make the steel for their boats. They've already shared that with an Australian company, and they gave them the right to make the steel under French standards, using Australian iron or Australian steel. Now you might say, well, hang on a second, I mean, Australian steel is pretty good, but of course the fact of the matter is that the steel that the French use is also used in the British nuclear submarines. And so this steel is for the hull, protected hull, is the best in the world. So we had access to that technology. And I think that a company in Australia, actually, I think it's based in Port Kembla, I'm not sure, can't quite recollect, but that company has the secret ingredients to make this steel now, which is it's a big thing to have. So from that would have developed obviously other industries, other systems. We've been involved probably making a steel for other French boats in the future, maybe in Adelaide, for sure. So those are the things that would run from it. Just by the way, as you probably know, the major cost and the major intellectual property, apart from the shape of the hull and all the rest of the bits and pieces, is the weapons guidance systems and the communication systems. And those, of course, are Americans. So billions of dollars of this deal were actually going to the United States anyway.
Look, I hate to beat my own chest, but I will. I got my PhD in Australian Defence Acquisition. And when you talk about, the Americans and what they were going to be giving to Australia to make the French boat interoperable with the Navy's order of battle, but also interoperable with the US fleet, there's this little thing called ITAR, the International Traffic and Arms Regulations. It's a real boondoggle of a thing, but what it effectively does is it protects American IP from being leaked out to third parties. It's a very strict proviso on pretty much all American high-tech equipment that gets sold onto third parties. Now, of course, yes, you're right. The Americans would have given us the fire support system or combat support system and various other systems and sensors. But they were very uncomfortable about putting it onto a French hull because I don't know, but, for a member of the Western Alliance, the French and the Americans seem to distrust each other quite a bit. And in terms of ITAR, I don't think that they even trusted the Australians from keeping all of America's IP, in that sort of sanctified, rarefied area. Can you say something about that?
Is it not right? Is it not right that the French, and I stand to be corrected on this, I thought the French submarines use the, I think it might be Lockheed Martin system in their weapons system. I think that they actually use it. So a whole bunch of this money, and I was talking about the money, not so much the technology. Oh, you're right, ITAR. I mean, I think they passed some laws in Congress to ease the passage of the transfer of technology.
Yeah.
But the money goes to the Americans. I mean, a large slice of it. We get to make the hull, and we get to make and we get access to certain technological benefits. But it's really, you look at the reactor. The reactor is going to be dropped in France. I mean, certainly it's going to be. We won't even, I don't think, be involved in any. I would have thought high tech, highly enriched uranium propulsion systems for the United States. So it's less problematic for the non-proliferation treaty, so I'm told, to be dealing with the French with low enriched uranium. So that system may well have allowed Australia to be involved in putting reactors in here eventually, but certainly not high enriched uranium that powers the American boats. So the avenue towards a nuclear future would have been, I would have thought, easier with the French than it was with the Americans, which makes you ask the question, well, why did they go that way? It had nothing to do with acquisitions and nothing to do with submarines, and everything to do with the strategic alliance that the Americans feared they were going to lose complete control over if the French were involved in the South Pacific or the Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific.
Well, which is really strange, coming from a post February 2022 climate as we do, you kind of think that it would have been in America's interest to strengthen the alliance, and by doing so, let the Australians and French collaborate any which way they like. It's going to be in America's interest anyway. If they end up having a really unique boat, it's going to help with whatever the Americans are going to be doing in the Indo-Pacific anyway. I understand America's paranoia, but I think it was really a misplaced paranoia to a great degree, right?
Absolutely. I think it was too. I mean, they work, the NATO works with the French and the French work with the Americans. They don't always agree, but sometimes it's a good idea to disagree with the Americans because sometimes
they make mistakes.
They make mistakes. I mean, look, I make mistakes. We all make mistakes. And
sure,
when you have a hegemonic power like the United States, it just, when I talk to military people who tell me this, I had no first-hand experience, but they do tend to just kind of want their own way, and their own way sometimes leads them into trouble. They need to listen to other people. I think the French would be good to balance it, but that's clearly not the way that Washington saw it. And I think that one of the things that came out of it, came out of my investigation, was that the absolute falsehood that the United States believed that France had been told, that Australia had told France, and that, you know, that the ALP were kind of okay, and I mean all this nonsense that was put out there, which was just swallowed hook, line, and sinker by our media, by my old colleagues and the in the Fourth Estate, and there was no pushback on this idea that maybe it was just a a way in which the Americans could get their own way rather than having to deal openly with the French. I mean, they wondered why they got their ambassadors pulled out of, maybe they didn't, but they said they did, out of Washington and Canberra. Well, it's no wonder. I mean, it was a truly unnecessarily shocking way to behave, and Morrison at the heart of it, the man with 5 secret ministries, and now he had sort of a secret. He'd actually divided the Defence Department in Australia into 2 segments. One was the French submarine segment, and the other segment was the American one. It was just, I mean, it really shattered a lot of people's morale inside the Defence Department. So if you want to actually get people working together under this very stressful environment as things change in our region, this is not the way to do it. You should be straightforward with your military people and take them into your confidence and tell them. Even tell the Australian public what you're up to. Even tell the French we're looking at something else. That's what Morrison said.
Sacre bleu. You can't do that.
Morrison said, he told Macron, these submarines are not fit for purpose. Conventional submarines are not fit for purpose. He then said, but I didn't tell him what we were considering. Well, if he told him that, why was he even bothering to continue the whole charade? He was, okay, no, I understand, you're not going to go with us, fine. But that's not what happened. Clearly, the evidence suggests that Macron was lied to, as he said. I don't think I know. He was lied to, and it was all just it was a way in which Morrison could end up. And it's hard to say this, but he could just end up ambushing Labour as being weak on national security and, horror of all horrors, anti-American.
But it wasn't just about Morrison and his pro-American, I don't know, Christian belief structure. That sort of really was very strange. But it was also about beating up within the Liberal National Coalition. I mean, we had Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who would, from an Australian perspective, be considered, I don't know, left of the party, centre-left. Yeah. There was that internal friction between the right of the party, the hawks on China, as well as, you know, the centre-left, the more, I suppose, chilled version of the party. How did it manifest, you know, the sort of political interference that was being run against Turnbull?
Well, I mean, I think, look, what I can say to that about the interference against Turnbull is that they couldn't wait to get rid of him. And if you look at the group that were in there, that was Abbott and Andrew Shearer, who's now Director General of National Intelligence, who doesn't actually do anything except supposedly do what he's told, which is to target the various agencies to gather the material and the assessments that are needed for the government. But he played a significant role in opposing the French submarine in the first place. Once the announcement was made, he wrote an article in which he said that the French did not share the same strategic requirements and alliances that we did, that Australia did. So he nailed himself to the mast there, saying he was opposed to it. And he was then the person that Morrison sent to Washington to negotiate this secret deal. In and out of the large building, the Eisenhower building next to the White House. You can track it online and see when he went in and when he left, as the calendar shows you. And that is part of the, if you like to trace it right back, it's part of the Howard ethos of drawing, of which he was, by the way, a security advisor to John Howard, Andrew Shearer, is to draw Australia in closer and closer to the United States. Paul Keating called these people Austro-Americans. Now, I mean, that might be a little bit too far. Some people call them Austrians, so Australians rather. It's the other way around. A bit too far. But certainly you track it back to Howard, you track it back to his love affair. I mean, if Menzies had a love affair with the United Kingdom, Howard had a love affair with America. And it's that arc, that trajectory that takes us through all the way to the present day, to the deal that was done involving Andrew Shearer, who rose from being a security advisor to the head of national intelligence.
I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. From Sydney, we're speaking with investigative journalist and author Andrew Fowler about his new book, Nuked, the submarine fiasco that sank Australia's sovereignty. Andrew, critics have argued that the French were backtracking on the promised 60% Australian content on the proposed short-fin Barracuda-class boats. How valid were these criticisms, and how did they impact on local industrial sentiments?
Look, there was no agreement in the original strategic agreement for any percentage of money to be spent on local industry. And the French version, which I, on balance, tend to believe, is that they tried a lot to discover industries that could be at the level that was required to make these sophisticated boats. And they couldn't get there, and they tried very hard. What they were talking about was trying to work with industry to lift the level so that they would be able to use Australian companies, and in the meantime they would probably use French companies. The problem we have is that the real reason why they were concerned, why the Australian government wanted 60%, was because it was kind of almost impossible to achieve. So what Naval Group decided to do to come up with a novel idea of dealing with this problem, they said, okay, look, we'll get to 60%, but we'll do, the first boat will be maybe 10%, next one 20%, next one 40, next one 80, and the average will be 60. But of course, none of that, even though it was agreed, was of any import, because the idea of the French actually building the boats had already been sunk. It was a furphy. It was a very malign, I think, move by the government to use that as an argument against French. You may notice nobody's talking about how many jobs there'll be in Australia when we're building, or when we're possibly involved in the future with building submarines with the United Kingdom and with the United States, particularly the United States. There's no suggestion at all that we'll have anything at all. And the cost is like, I don't know, it's like 10 times bigger than the French boats. So I think when you look at it in that way, it strikes me as being demonstrable nonsense to suggest that somehow that was a problem, that the French weren't actually honouring some agreement. There was no agreement. They actually came up and said, yeah, we'll do it, even though it's not in the contract, because the French argument is that this wasn't a contract. This was a strategic government-to-government agreement. This was more than just building boats. It was about building a strategic arrangement.
Was there a level of naivete in Paris with regard to what they were dealing with in Australia? And by that, I mean, do you think the French, and I hate to use this because it's a well-known trope that the French can appear arrogant from time to time, but do you think that the French at the time thought that they had the Australians measure, that they were sophisticated enough, that they would be able to, manage Australian expectations in the way that only French people can manage Australian expectations?
Okay, I'll try and get this as straight as I can for you because it's quite complicated, but it's like this. In the Élysée Palace, there was Macron's senior advisor, a guy called Philippe Etienne. He is brilliant, and he's a really good diplomat, and he's a very plain speaker. He's very honest, straightforward, and he was the person who was involved in negotiating the original submarine deal. And he worked very closely with the Australian ambassador in Paris, Brendan Byrne, and it was a really good relationship. So what happened is that Macron moved Philippe Etienne to Washington as the ambassador, and he brought in his place a guy by the name of Emmanuel Bond. Emmanuel Bond, yeah, that's right. And Emmanuel Bond was anything but the Philippe Etienne character. He was old style Frenchman, kind of Gaullist, rather imperial, and of course we had a changing of the guard at the same time, or more or less around the same time. So he had Turnbull moving out, and then we had Morrison moving in. So those two things happening at the same time. We then had Morrison up against this chap who was a little sort of, as you quite rightly pointed out, a rather haughty Frenchman. So there was a clash, and I was told that at that time the French thought they had it in the bag, didn't need to worry about it. This is like, we've done the work, so just get on with it and be grateful that you're dealing with a great former imperial power. This can be problematic, as you can probably appreciate, but it's not the exact reason why they shifted, why they dumped the French and went elsewhere. I mean, it was to do with other things, as we've explained before. But it is important to know that the characters do play a role in this. And Morrison was, he went to Biarritz for a G7 meeting, and he was just bristling when he went past Macron. I mean, it was just like, it was really bad vibes. But as I say, Morrison's intention was never to go with the French. Anyway, really, once he rolled Turnbull, he wanted to shove the French out of the way, and he had people like Shearer in his ear, and he was talking to him before he became the Director of National Intelligence, and so moving them out and moving on, and then pointing to this French nobleman and saying, look, this is what they're like, and it's also difficult to get contact. At one time, to make your point, there was an attempt to connect Morrison with the Elysee, and they couldn't get through. And the ambassador at the time got so infuriated with the embassy, with this new arrival, he shut down communications with the French, the embassy and the Elysee for 6 weeks. He said, "That's it. Don't take any calls. Don't make any calls. We'll leave it at that." Well, after a few weeks, they said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well, Morrison's saying I can pick up the phone to Trump, and he'll talk to me in a day. Why I'm having trouble talking to you guys?" Which is a fair point. It's a fair point. And so they rolled on from that, and then there were new impediments that emerged that were more substantial and they could use to attack the French.
I'm reminded of my little incident with the French at the sub-summit back in 2015. The French didn't send any senior delegate to the sub-summit. I think at that time, thought that they had the upper hand, and they didn't have to convince the Australian government nor industry reps of anything, basically, that they had the best design. C'est la vie. So there was this, when on the second day we brought out the Japanese admirals and they dropped the bomb, you couldn't have heard a pin drop in the audience, because everyone thought that the Japanese bid was so tied with Tony Abbott's wanting to have the boats built in Japan, that when the two rear admirals came out with Shinzo Abe's imprimatur and said, "No, we will build those boats here in Adelaide and we'll tell you how," it was just amazing. So the German delegation was scrambling for an answer because, again, they themselves were rather arrogant and thinking that they were the second ones on the block, but very close to the French. They didn't expect the Japanese to pull a swift one like that. But then there was this young kid, and I think he would have been in his, I don't know, early 20s, pimply-faced. And he came up to me and said, "Oh, Dr. Bruni, well, so I'm on the phone to the boss of DCNS, which was the company, the French company at the time that was preparing the French bid." And he said, "Oh, look, we humbly apologize for not sending a more senior person than myself." I mean, that poor kid must have been the local cleaner or something. I don't know. He certainly didn't have the street cred to be at a place like that. And ironically, we had France 24 cover the whole damn thing. So you would have thought that the French would have sent out somebody. But, at that time, the skullduggery was already in play, I suspect.
Yeah. Good point.
Speaking of cultural issues. In your book, you discuss about the cultural differences between, the way the French build submarines, the way that Australians operate. Then there are things like, the way that work is being done, that, the French like their lunches. The Australians can't really get in the way of that. And the French would always run their meetings 15 minutes over the allotted time because they like to make sure that everything is all done the French way. How big an issue was this? And had we continued with the French, would we have bedded ourselves down in this system, or would the Australians have always butted their heads against the French and their way of doing things?
Look, it's a very, very good question. Obviously, it's difficult to answer that question because it is hypothetical. I would
Yeah.
have thought that the French, once they identified the problem, actually did do their best to deal with it at a practical level. They had a book that they would, because they sold a lot of stuff overseas, so they'd sort of work out what the cultural differences are. And the big mistake they made, I mean, they'd sell to India or they'd sell to another country that have how do the Indians do things, what do they do, what's their cultural work practice, etc. One of the problems they had at the beginning was they actually thought the Australians were like the English or like the British. And it was a realization that that wasn't the case, that they actually produced an Australian version of that cultural handbook and how to handle the problems. Um, I think that you would always have had that cultural difference,
Yeah.
but they were going out of their way. And I'm not a spokesman for the French naval group, but they were going out of their way in building schools, creches. The French were learning English in Cherbourg. They were keen to do that because they wanted this deal, and they were proud of their boat, and so they were doing all those kind of things. Now, whether or not you could have got over this problem that is like the sanctity of the lunch break, which is like it's a 2 hour break and you stop and then you start work again, whereas we sort of sit at the desk and eat a sandwich, and the French don't do that. That sort of stuff will be difficult. The other thing is punctuality. The French will tend to be sort of maybe not so punctual. Australians will, what time is it? I went to see somebody who was one of those sort of back streets of Paris meetings, and I was told, you 9 o'clock. So at precisely 30 seconds to 9, I moved forward and I rang the bell at exactly 9 o'clock. And he opened the door, this person, he said to me, "That's amazing." He said, "That's incredible. You're absolutely on time." I said, "Well, that's what we do. I mean, and it's important to meet you." And so that was part of my understanding of the way the cultural differences were. But also I did it because it was an important meeting and he needed to know I was going to be, what can I say, punctual and and uh, and professional, which was really important to win his confidence.
Hmm.
The other issue of Aussie on the other side is to be that they might be punctual, but my understanding of it is at times they'll say, "How do we solve this problem now? Well, why don't we have a go at doing that? Let's just do that now, and then if it doesn't work, we'll fix it up later. We'll make it work. It's a working process. We'll work our way through this." The French know they will debate everything down to the last centimeter or even less than that, and then say, "Okay, bang, now we'll do it." It's what the Russians say is measure 7 times and cut once. I think the French probably measure 70 times and cut once, which would get in the way of some of the Australian work practices, which are just different. They're not better or worse, but they're just different.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Indulge me in a bit more hypothetical stuff. Had Australia continued with the French submarine deal, Andrew, would it have enhanced Australia's sovereignty, or would it have just replaced American influence with French?
Look, I think there's no way that you can replace American influence with French in this country. It's impossible. The amount of hardware that's owned by the United States and at times is co-used by Australia makes it it's impossible. There is no real way to escape that over the short term. Over the long term, yes, there is a possibility of doing that. I don't think that France would have had the kind of clout that America's got here. I think culturally and also just physically and strategically, the way that the two countries now have interchangeable military systems. So it's really in lockstep. And I think that the idea that there would have been more independence. There may have been a degree of independence. I mean, had Macron's tripartite arrangement with France, India, and Australia got up, he mentioned America in passing, but that would have actually swung things around. It would have been a more interesting configuration from an independent point of view. So I do think that this was the last hurrah of any sovereignty that Australia had in its strategic defence and foreign policy.
You said some, oh, sorry, you said some interesting things in your book with regard to Malcolm Turnbull, because, you know, he did push the French submarine boat very strongly. And it may be because he himself is very independent minded, both in the Liberal Party and just as a person of politics. You know, he was part of that Republican movement. He saw Australia being more robust, shall we say, and by that we could infer that that may mean being able to say no ever so often to the United States. You had former Prime Minister Paul Keating, former Labor Party Prime Minister Paul Keating, come out and shellac the whole notion of AUKUS spectacularly. I mean, so spectacularly, I think that if anyone actually went through the video again, they'd think he was completely unhinged. But the fact remains, you know, there are some strong views out there. So do you think that with Turnbull having been an independent figure and someone who wanted Australia to mature in that way, that also that actually was a motivation for him to continue with the French bid, because he saw that acquisition as something to fulfill Australia's sovereignty at the strategic level?
Look, I think that there's certainly an argument that you can put up in that way. But the problem with it is that the French boat was chosen after this competitive evaluation process, and it was the best boat. It just also happened to be, by happenstance, something which gave you some leverage against the United States and gave you a degree of independence that you certainly wouldn't have if you just went with the Americans. And I think that Turnbull's role coincided with the selection of the boat. I think he was enthusiastic because he's an independentist and because he was a co-founder of the Australian Republican movement. I mean, he took on the British establishment with a spy catcher case and won. I mean, you know, he is a fair dinkum Australian independentist. And what's happened in politics, of course, is that anybody who stands as an independent Australian is now seen as being, according to the Liberal Party, kind of on the extreme left, as though being a nationalist and a national independentist somehow puts you politically to a left of centre. But to answer your question, had he, which is hypothetical, remained in power, had the French vote been accepted, I think there would have been a degree of independence, a degree. You wouldn't have lost, I think, all of your sovereignty. I don't think you've lost it all, but there's not much left. There's not much wriggle room now. We're in the Americans. We can look. Two people in the United States. Kurt Campbell was one of them. He said, as did Chuck Schumer, Senate leader. He said, "Don't worry about the boats. They're ours anyway. Don't worry about the boats Australia's getting. You know, we need 66 boats to contain China. If we lose 3, don't worry about that loss. It's not a loss because they're with our mates, and we'll use them anyway." So that kind of shows you the view from Washington about how we are like an appendage to their military.
Yeah.
And this French boat would have actually just put the skids on that a little bit, just put the brakes on that view, and would have reminded the Americans that we actually can make decisions separately and differently from them. We've joined every war they've been in, I recollect, since 1945 for a variety of reasons, but this may have been different, and it may well still be different that Australia will not be engaged in any war with China, but it'll be very difficult to get out of, not just about the submarines, because they'll be used anyway, however the Americans want to use them, but because of the infrastructure we have which supports the American war effort.
Andrew, can you discuss the complexities and International Atomic Energy Agency's concerns regarding a non-nuclear power like Australia operating nuclear-powered submarines? Now, under the old regime, when we had the French deal, the French, had they been so inclined, would have offered us low-enriched uranium nuclear-powered propulsion. Under the new AUKUS arrangements, we'll be going with the American and British version of high enriched uranium nuclear power. So what is the difference between the two, and why would the IAEA be concerned with the likes of a little country like Australia going down this path?
Well, look, I'll take you to Washington on this. I had a briefing from somebody who allowed me to use the information but not to name them. And I asked them, who owns the boats? And they said, we do, Australia. So I said, so, okay, who owns the reactor? And he said, we do. I said, who owns the highly enriched uranium in the reactor? And he said, good point, we're working on it. So that was the issue. And that issue is central to the problem that we have. I mean, apart from all the who owns the boats, I mean, this stuff is bomb-grade material. And as a signatory to the NPT, we are not allowed to have possession of that. There's an argument, which I'll go into later on, but in the Netherlands, during the Cold War, the last Cold War, not the present one, the Americans stored nuclear weapons in the Netherlands, and they gave their sovereignty to those weapons to the Americans, so that they were not in breach of the NPT, or the great anti-nuclear movement that the Netherlands had. How do we know that? Because the Prime Minister came out a few years ago and said, the old Prime Minister said, goodness me, we haven't still got those weapons, have we? I thought we got rid of them. So, that's the major issue. So the sovereignty issue of who owns the highly enriched uranium. Now, there is some wriggle room here, as there always is in those kind of treaties, and it goes to whether or not, if you are using this uranium in a military establishment, in a boat, like a submarine, you're not actually covered by the NPT. So the Iranians were very keen on, if Australia, as an NPT signatory, as is Iran, were actually to get possession of a nuclear powered boat using highly enriched uranium, then why can't they?
Yeah.
And that would be out of sight in a military complex. So the IAEA are wrestling with that particular issue, and no doubt the Americans, who, by the way, were very concerned about this particular issue when it all started, and also they're looking at what that means strategically in the Middle East at the moment. If we were to get possession of these boats, and they were not to be owned by the United States, so it's a very complex area, and it needn't have been like this. It could have been a lot more straightforward, and it could have been a lot cheaper. And that's the issue. That's the issue that drove me to write this book. And I'm still, as a journalist, you kind of get involved in the story. You try and stand back. You try to look at the objective truth. But when you see this act, and you see, when you see people being chased down the road for being overpaid $100 on their social security, and some people committing suicide, and you see this waste of money, this excessive expenditure on submarines that we may not own, and I would suggest that possibly we may not even get to own, It questions you. It's a real moral question about this as well, not just a military political question.
There's also something that kind of bothers me with the French equation. If you don't mind me, I'll just try to quickly unpack it. I mean, we wouldn't have been completely independent with the French bid had it gone ahead anyway, because as you point out in your book, there was going to be a period of time where we would have had to have cycled our submarines to France so that they then can refuel the boats, right? And I think that the boats would have been in the French dock for somewhere in the vicinity of what, 6 months, 8 months,
Right.
something like that. So they
Yeah.
would have been out of the water and not in the Royal Australian Navy service at that time.
Yeah.
So if France, for instance, had a problem with Australia joining an American military operation and they had two or three of our boats being refueled, what's to say that Paris would have just said to the Australian, the diplomats and, well, those boats, we don't like the way that you're playing with the Americans over that sensitive point called China. We're going to deny giving you spare parts. We're going to go slow on refueling the boats. I mean, at what point would France also exercise its great power role over us in a similar way to we're used to how the United States deals with us? We're a small fry and we still have our connections out there. And had we gone French, we would have had our connections to the French and they would have held the whip hand.
Right, right. It's always problematic when you're offshoring your maintenance and your refueling of your major strategic asset. And that's clearly why Adelaide would have played a future role in making it possible to run that kind of nuclear operation in Adelaide. That was the important consideration, using low enriched uranium. We cannot do that, and we'll never be able to do that with the American boats. So your point's well made, and I take it that was one of the advantages. Now, in the meantime, between Adelaide getting up and these boats going backwards and forwards every few years to be refueled, certainly that was a vulnerability. Absolutely, I think you're quite right. One of the reasons why you need to have a strategic asset that's based here and can be serviced here, because of the sea lane problems and the supply lines and all the rest of it that we learned so much about during COVID, and Japan learned about in the Second World War. But so you do have that problem, but of the two, the bigger problem is clearly the United States, because I wouldn't think that France isn't. I mean, what would be in it for France to stop us from going with the United States? It's a bit of a double step, whereas it's a single step for America to say they want to use the boats to quarantine or to attack China.
Yeah, well, they could also say we're going to deploy your boats to the Middle East because, well, we need to look after Israel. And then we'll end up having a bifurcated Navy one way or the other, run by the United States and not by the Royal Australian Navy, which I
Yeah.
think is a danger to our sovereignty. So, couple of extra questions before we wrap up. Why is there a perception that the Australian Labor Party hesitates to upset American interests? Is this indicative of a broader weakness in the party's national security policy, do you think?
I think the fear is embedded in the Labour Party, um, going back decades, going back to the the Whitlam dismissal. I mean, it goes back that far, and it's just written so large in the history of the Labour Party that they are so concerned, and they have experienced the Americans turning off the intelligence in the 80s, when they suspected there was a KGB asset in Asia, and they turned down the intelligence, and they so Australia, so Labour Party particularly is concerned, is worried about that sort of stuff. It just goes back to, I mean, I like the statement that President Carter had relayed to Gough Whitlam, and I think it was 1978, out at the old international terminal at Sydney, and he said that please tell the former Prime Minister that America will never again interfere in the domestic politics of Australia. So if you don't get that, I think, I think that's, if you do get that, you understand the sort of it's not really paranoia, it's an understanding of how powerful America is. I mean, America is an extremely powerful country to deal with for the European Union, let alone a country of 20 million, 26 million people. Particularly now as we're in this sort of, in this area of the world, which has become so important to the United States. So they, I think, have every reason to be concerned about the way the United States might behave. And that certainly is what made them jump. And Morrison knew this too. He knew that by dropping in this at the last minute, you asked the question, why did he drop it in? What was it? Less than 24 hours before the announcement of AUKUS, and it was done to ambush. Why did he think it would ambush them? Well, he hoped, in fact, I'm told, that Albanese would have rejected it. Then he could fight the election on like a khaki election, anti-American election. Don't forget, Morrison and the Fourth Estate, newspapers, television, beat the drums of war in the period leading up to this decision to drop the French. We were to be terrified. We were to run to Mother Washington to protect us from the evil, the old trope about the yellow peril. This all stoked up in people's emotions, and so then he comes up with the answer, AUKUS. I mean, that's how I think politically putrid this whole thing is.
But Albanese must be grating under the fact that he has to continue with the whole AUKUS play now, because it's now a done deal, apparently. Now, of course, that there is a caveat here, and the caveat is we don't know whether it's a done deal if we have another Trump administration. If we have another Trump administration, Trump being isolationist, and it's all about American jobs, America first, maybe he thinks, well, those Australians can have our submarines, but they'll be built in American shipyards. And if that were the case, all the money that we've spent up to now will just be evaporated again. Australian defence acquisition, ladies and gentlemen, it's a curse. Let me tell you, it's a curse. But yeah, look, I think that really is a problem that we face, and with a prime minister that perhaps doesn't see AUKUS as a great thing for Australia, but has to basically suck it up and just continue with the plan as it's structured until the externals pull the plug from it. Gosh, I tell you, not a good position to be in.
Right. I think that's right. I think that after the election, when Labor won the election, one and possibly more ministers asked the question, how do we get out of this? How do we get out of this AUKUS deal? And the answer was, well, they had an opportunity when they set up the review. And funnily enough, the review, according to Sam Rogerveen, who's ex-ONA, and a good strategic thinker, he said that basically it was they came up with the answer. You could have actually said, well, we don't need these nuclear submarines because we're defending our coastline and we're defending the sea lanes around us. What, of course, David Gould said, the UK Under-Secretary of Defence said, was that the reason we had these boats was because they were fast and they could go up to the coast of China and work with the Japanese and the Americans. So that's the reason why we got them, to be with the Americans, to contain, and you may say go further than containing China. I mean, it's extremely dangerous what's happening up there on the coast. We're dropping sonar buoys, we're tagging Chinese submarines off their coast. It's like playing mini war games off the coast, off the heads of Sydney, in their territorial area. And we claim it's international waters, and it's in the economic zone, but it's not inside their limit. But India and Indonesia don't like the use of military boats and ships being used for military purposes when transiting what we call international waters through their archipelago. So this is a very dangerous, very, very, very dangerous time. And I suppose the one thing you could say is that I'm rather glad that at least we don't have Scott Morrison as the Prime Minister, because I think he he was and is and probably will be in the future a very dangerous person for us to cope with. He's working now in a company that's selling his expertise on as a consultant on AUKUS. He's working with Mike Pompeo, who's the former Secretary of State and former CIA director. So they're sort of feeding off the beast of this massive carcass, which we're funding. I think that's really really dangerous and difficult for us, because if you want to be independent, you've got a former prime minister who's working with a former CIA director. To me, it strikes me as being far too close for comfort.
Well, as they say, the snouts are in the trough, and for a big boondoggle like AUKUS, there's a lot of gravy to go around. So I can understand. I mean, I don't appreciate it as an Australian taxpayer, but I can understand why Morrison was tempted by the goodies after his prime ministership. So in hindsight, Andrew, what were the implications of cancelling the French submarine deal for Australia's strategic alliances and defence capabilities? I mean, we damaged our relations with the Japanese because up to a point, the Japanese did think they were an actual contender to have their submarine, the Soryu class, replace the Collins class submarine. And then we damaged our relations with France when we shafted them and gave them the fait accompli of AUKUS. So what does that say about Australian diplomacy? I know what it says about an acquisition. Our acquisition sucks.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem really is kind of greater than that. I mean, the French are saying, they say, look, we know you're an Anglo country. We get it. We understand. You're Anglo. You're with the Anglos. They're not in the Five Eyes. They're kind of now the Six Eye, but they're not part of that close group, and they understand that. I think what they don't understand is to be treated in this way, and to be so shabbily treated, so badly treated, and to end up with the country treating you really badly actually ends up treating itself badly. They just don't understand how you can actually use this as a weapon, as a political weapon inside your own country. It's like it's so self-defeating. And the bigger question is that, can you trust the Australian government in the future?
That's right.
And they talk about, these are sort of journalists are always being warned about, well, be careful because this is, are you damaging the strategic and the military interest of Australia? These stories, the law is now getting tighter and tighter around what's deemed to be in the national interest and what's not. Well, if what they've done with AUKUS is in the national interest, I'll eat my hat. It's clearly not in the national interest. If there was a way to prosecute the people involved in this, I would fully support that. And I'd fully support an investigation into the way that this thing was handled. Because the public service, for example, which is supposedly stands between the executive and the people, and deals with the legislature and implements the policy, was completely politicized and was asked to take sides. You had the head of the ADF out there talking about war in 2025 and beating the drums of war. Mike Pezzulo. Well, we know about Mike Pezzulo. And how do you have to repair? Labor is, I think, now trying to repair the public service, and introducing a way of not tenure, but certainly getting rid of outside advisors to the way that the other side, the Liberal Party, had. But going to that central question, I think the politicisation of the public service, I think the amount of money that was wasted, I think the secrecy, there should be an investigation. The problem you have is, of course, that both parties are in lockstep, Labor and the Liberal Party, National Coalition. And just as the coalition sacrificed Australia's sovereignty to win an election, to wedge, Labor too did the same thing, sacrificed the sovereignty and bought a dud.
Andrew Fowler, thanks for joining us again on sharing your insights on the focus.
Thanks, John.
From Sydney, that was investigative journalist and author Andrew Fowler. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Andrew Fowler. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Andrew and connect with him on social media. If you want a copy of Andrew's book, Nuked, please contact Melbourne University Press, your local bookstore, or your favourite online purveyors of the written word. It was a thought-provoking read. What do you think about Australia's strategic sovereignty? Has it been compromised by the country's commitment to AUKUS? Let us know in the comments section. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we would appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have any comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my very best to respond to as many of them as I can. My thanks as ever to the producers of The Focus, Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.